Right, I think we're all here. So morning, everyone, and welcome to the second webinar in our People and Leadership Development series, where we are focusing on imposter syndrome, a topic which certainly shows up more often than you may think. It is fantastic to see so many here today. Thank you for taking the time to be with us, especially those of you joining us from across Australia and the UK. We have over 200 participants online with us this morning, a number who were with us when we discussed the importance of leaders and the role that they play in developing a culture that promotes psychological safety and building trust. This is the second webinar in a series that we have planned over the next few months, where we will discuss a variety of topics that influence employee and team engagement, leadership and organisational development, developing our people, developing our teams, and looking at new and innovative ways of creating empowering and productive organisational cultures. My name is Nick Shepherd. I'm the Chief Executive here at Smart Leader, and it is my privilege to once again be the panel host for today's session. We've got a fantastic panel lined up, highly experienced leadership and organisational development senior practitioners who are going to share their thoughts and reflections on the topic. And then we'll all be available to answer questions that you may have at the end of the webinar. Thank you in advance to those who have already sent through some questions. We plan to answer those if we have time towards the end of the session. So let me introduce our fabulous panel. Let's start with Gareth Lorrigan. Gareth is the ISL Country Manager for Australia and our ISL Program Director. Gareth leads the ISL team that delivers the Strategic Leadership and Leadership Step Up residential programs, and has been coaching senior executive leaders and chief executives across New Zealand and Australia, UK, and up into Europe now for over 10 years. And in between programs, he is actively involved in facilitating team dynamic and team performance workshops, ongoing coaching, and providing client services and support. Good morning, Gareth. How are you?
Good morning, Nick. Thanks for the warm welcome.
You're very welcome. Second on our panel, Angela Neely. Angela's got 30 plus years of senior HR and organisational development role experience in organisations of between 10 and greater than 1,000 people, including companies like Metro Water, Vodafone, the Warehouse Group, and EPCO, where she was head of OD and chief people officer. Angela has worked with Smart Leader now for the last 3 years and recently moved into the organisational lead role, where she leads the team in organisational development. Good morning, Angela.
Kia ora. Nice to be here, Nick. Thank you.
Fabulous to have you on again. Thank you. And finally, we've got Amanda Woolridge. Amanda is an executive leadership coach for the Institute for Strategic Leadership and has coached senior executives and middle managers throughout New Zealand, Australia, and the UK since 2000. Amanda is a graduate of Coach U's Advanced Coach Training Program and is accredited in a wide range of programs and tools to help support leaders build awareness, improve communication, increase in staff engagement. An incredibly experienced and senior practitioner. Good morning to you, Amanda.
Morena, Nick, and good morning to you. How are you?
Very good, thank you.
Good.
So the aim of today's session is to discuss and define imposter syndrome and the importance it plays on employee and team engagement, and to ultimately, what is the effect that this has on performance and organisational culture? What are the different types that there are, and how do these show up? And then the panel are going to discuss some tips and actions, some tricks that you can take away with you to better understand this important topic and how to respond to this in an effective manner. Then, like I said at the end, if we've got time, we've got some Q&A, and we look forward to those questions that have already been sent through. So, introductions complete. Let's get underway. And I'd like to start by asking Amanda if you might be able to set the scene for us. Tell us a little bit about what is this imposter syndrome and what are the different types of and symptoms of this condition?
Okay, thank you, Nick. So imposter syndrome really is a psychological pattern or way of thinking where you perceive yourself as a fraud or imposter. And underlying that is this fear that's quite pervading around being found out. I must say, actually, that when I heard everybody's credentials and experience being sort of spoken about, and then it came to me, it's just that little feeling that you get where it's like, wow,
That's
how
right.
do I sit amongst this group? So it's that feeling. And it's a feeling that's pervasive, despite the evidence you might have that you're succeeding, and often actually happens to high achievers. So, for example, on programs, some of the ways in which we see it arise is that when people's 360-degree feedback, a person rates themselves much lower than all of the rest of the people, whether it be their team colleagues or their boss. So there's quite a difference there. And it's often seen in that symptom of people discounting praise. So when you acknowledge somebody for doing something good, they'll say, oh yeah, anybody could have done it, or oh, it was just dumb luck, or, you know, those kind of things where people are not actually taking on that praise. So there's a couple of things where we see it arise. And most often it comes up in high achievers who put a lot of pressure on themselves to perform.
Right.
And one might argue that, you know, most leaders put pressure on themselves to perform. So it can sort of have a little snippet there. And also it's often triggered when we're in a place where we're given a new role or some new responsibilities, and we just feel a little bit out of our depth, and we just get that sense of doubt that creeps in. And then what happens on the inside is a common misperception that no one else can possibly feel this way, which then sets up that sense of I'm feeling a little bit ashamed about this, and I'm not going to then disclose, or I'm going to stay quiet. So it's sort of a hidden thing that happens on the inside.
Right.
And of course, triggers us into all sorts of impacts, which I know we're going to be speaking about, Nick. So you also asked what are the different types, and
Yes.
Dr. Valerie Young came up with 5 specific types, which you can find in more detail on the internet. And the first type is perfectionist. I've mentioned that word already, and that's when a person has impossible standards. Well, perfection is an impossible target to reach, actually. And if you're a perfectionist, you're going to get quite obsessed by the details, and then maybe not trust others in terms of then stepping into micromanaging or taking over. That's the first. The second is experts. And we often find this in sort of university fields or people with PhDs, where they think they should know it all. And what often happens as people got the leadership ladder is, you know, I'm looking after a new department. I think I should know all of it. Then I go further up the ladder and I'm looking after departments I know nothing about. And then that sets up that sort of imposter syndrome feeling. And the third type is the natural genius who has always found it really easy to actually succeed. It's just come really easily to them. And then somewhere along the line, they actually have a challenge, and, you know, it flaws them actually, because they have a belief inherently that success is inherent. But if that's you, you're in good company, because apparently Einstein had that going on later in life. He actually called himself an involuntary swindler. So that's kind of interesting.
Wow. Is that
Yeah.
right?
And also the fourth type is the soloist. So that's the sort of person who feels the need to be able to do it all independently. And so they'll often go it alone and really struggle to actually have help. And they think that asking for help is a weakness. And then the fifth type are Young called them the superheroes, supermen and superwomen, who feel like they need to help everyone all of the time. So they feel guilty about taking breaks. They feel guilty not working. And so they can find themselves falling into a pattern of burnout. So those are the 5 types.
Fascinating. And it's interesting now that we're talking about this. It's so important. I'm just reflecting on those types, Amanda, and I was chief executive relatively early in my career. And I'm just thinking that number 2, expert, just resonated so clearly with me. I thought leadership at the time was you had to have all the answers, and it was my job to come up with all the answers. Nobody told me that leaders don't necessarily need to have all the answers. In fact, it's about bringing people around you, great people around you, to build that understanding. So I wish I'd have had this webinar a few years back. How prevalent is imposter syndrome, Amanda? What do we know about that? How often does it show up?
Yeah. So it's what's interesting is the earlier research was really centered around women. So a lot of what we know is based on that in terms of sample studies. So the term imposter syndrome, it was actually originally called imposter phenomenon, actually, by Dr. Pauline Clance and Dr. Suzanne Imes, who studied undergrad medical students, and they were women. And they found that it was absolutely rife in the women. And since that time, there's been sort of a lot of the research oriented around female executives. There's one done by KPMG in 2020 where they looked at 750 high-performing female executives, and 75% of them felt imposter syndrome. So it's rife, but actually a lot of that research got challenged by men saying, hang on a moment, it's going on in us too. So in the last sort of decade, there's been more research that's widened and broadened it a little bit. Hub Events did a really interesting one in 2019 where they surveyed 1,000 UK adults, and they had 3 years experience. So they had work experience and they had credentials, so they knew what they were doing, they were successful. And 80% of the men had imposter syndrome.
Wow.
And 90% of the women. So what we know is it's something that's here and kind of passes through all of us. And interestingly, I'm not really a huge fan of the term imposter syndrome. It sounds a little bit like a kind of disease, a medical disease. I think that personally, what's more apt is imposter moments. So, you know, we all have moments where it sweeps in and sweeps out. And maybe rather than think about how prevalent is it, as in how many people have it, it's more a case of how often and how pervasive is it, and is it something that comes in and out, or is it something that really swamps you? And in my experience, it's something that's in us and can get triggered at any given time.
Where does it come from? Is it hardwired? Is it an environmental? Is it cultural? What's your thoughts around that?
Yeah, well, based on the empirical research, it's influenced in early childhood, like many of these things are. So those external voices of our primary caregivers are really significant for all of us. That, you know, if you think about a baby born on the planet with its mind wide open, and then this programming takes place, doesn't it? So the mother's voice apparently is especially influential when it comes to imposter syndrome. So it can be the mum or dad or an older sibling. So the 6-year-old is going to take on the thoughts that are pervasive within the family, really. And there's a really great sort of piece of prose or poem by Dorothy Knoll that talks about if a child lives with criticism, they're going to learn to condemn. If a child lives with approval, they're going to learn to like themselves. And so that kind of gets set up early on. But I would also add just a sort of thought around, if you step into any sort of scenario, there's a basic human need to feel a sense of belonging. And if you show up and you're different from that group, or there's that sort of hard work around trying, you know, belonging, if you look different, if you're a different gender, a different ethnicity, anything that's different, there's going to be that little moment of kind of doubting and questioning oneself and feeling a little bit like a fraud. So, you know, it sort of sets up early, and then your experiences kind of continue to compound that thinking. So it's something that's sort of in there. It's a voice, isn't it? It's that little voice of the inner critic.
Right. So if it's compounding, I mean, that, you know, bringing in Gareth now. Gareth, from your experience with coaching and leading, guide on the side to a number of senior executives and chief executives at a governance and leadership level, what are your insights on this, and how do you see this playing out?
I mean, look, I think collectively, this is an issue for organisations and even society in a wider context. What are our value systems that we've got in place? How do we reward people? Even how do we discipline people, promote them? How do we challenge them? So I think, the one thing is to assess the symptoms of it, but, how do we treat this scenario, from an organizational point of view, from a team or department point of view down to a one-on-one point of view, stance. So, there's quite a big impact on organizations from an engagement and productivity point of view. And when you're having engagement and productivity issues, that has a knock-on effect to things like profitability and outcomes for communities if you're in a not-for-profit or government organization. So, the loss of productivity and even understanding the depth in your organization of the talent you got. Like, the talent pools are so scarce at the moment.
Wow.
How do we understand more about who's really in our organization? Why are they not stepping up? What are the unpolished diamonds that are in our organizations? Rather than to have a look further afield, how do we actually assess what's happening in our organization and promote people to step onto the road less traveled, so to speak?
And in that progression and looking at the succession planning from within, do you think setting up cultures and processes and systems to enable people to deal with what might be the imposter syndrome as they continue that leadership journey is important for organizations to consider?
Yeah, look, your natural tendency would probably to make things easier and comfortable for people, but I'm not sure that's necessarily the answer. It's, how do you make them more resilient, and how do you even understand and measure organizations' mental resilience, or mojo, as you like to say at Smart Leader? How do we get a really good understanding of what's in there would probably be the foundation on helping to resolve these issues. But the implications on the talent step's amazing. Like, am I good enough? Am I ready for this job? Some people need to be overqualified before they go for that job, where there's other people that, in some forms of narcissism, maybe are going for jobs before they're well and truly ready. So, but, how do we support humans to get the most out of it?
Sure. Thanks, Gareth. Angela, in your years of experience with organizational development, leads in various chief people officer roles in the HR space, what's your thoughts around imposter syndrome?
Yeah, so thank you, Nick. Look, I would say, from a team's perspective, the first step is actually looking after yourself first. So lead self before you can lead others. It's probably one of to Gareth's point, step out of that comfort zone and into that growth zone where you're going, what, I'm not aware if I've got it. And maybe there are people on this seminar that are sitting there going, well, I wonder, Amanda rattled through the different types, and I wonder which one of those I am, if I am at all. So probably the first thing would be just to build that self-awareness piece. So move from that unconscious incompetent, thinking of the quadrant for a moment, into that conscious incompetent. It's like, okay, I know I'm aware what I don't, what I'm not, that I might be one of these things. And then into that, okay, I'm aware of it, I understand it, and what am I going to do about it? And how do I consciously manage this? Through to that, well, it's second nature. I know it's going to pop up and I know what to do, but it's more unconscious in my management or accommodation of the moments that pop up. So look, Nick, for me, working in a team and thinking about that team sort of situation, again, using another model, I think of that iceberg, so we've got needs met and unmet. Gosh, just sharing for a moment, I was adopted at birth and I grew up in a world where I needed, in my own mind, to be the perfect child, because what if I got sent back? Now, what that transpired, go forward 40, 50 years, about a decade ago, I found myself, to Amanda's point, being the superhuman, where I felt I needed to be working masses of hours. So I found myself doing, 18-hour days, 6 days a week, because I thought I needed to be that superhuman. Now, of course, that didn't work. I fell over, went through massive burnout, But more importantly, for the benefit of this, for the group here, what it meant was that I wasn't actually being of service to myself or to the team.
Right.
Because the behaviours that created in the team were quite dysfunctional. So I became very aware very quickly of my own
I can imagine, yeah.
and just allowing myself to pause, reflect, and re-choose. So that's really the bit that can become uncomfortable until you get used to doing it. In the diversity, equity, inclusion space, if we don't allow our team and the people that work around us to be their authentic self, then in a way we're really taking away an opportunity to allow the differences that we all naturally bring and perspectives we all bring to create the best scenarios. So whether it's for a client we're working with, or whether it's, trying to problem solve something, we need our differences to be on the table to present and to create and debate and challenge so that we can get the best possible outcomes. Right. So I think, the imposter syndrome being something that can creep in when we're uncomfortable with perhaps our own version of ourselves, the true authentic version of ourselves, if we do manage it and get hold of it and just be aware of those moments in a very authentic way, then I think we do have a real opportunity to better ourselves and our teams and our organizations as a result. So it's the word authentic keeps cropping up.
Thank you. Thanks, Angela, for sharing that. And authentic and being vulnerable and having a culture, an organizational culture that enables that to occur. They would be very important elements also.
Absolutely. Look, I can tell a story. I was talking to a relative of mine, and he's retired, been retired for a while now. And I was talking to him a couple of months ago and said, so Graham, have you ever thought of having, whether you have imposter syndrome or not? And he reflected, a little like what you were saying for yourself, Nick, he started in a CEO role of one of New Zealand's largest insurance organisations at a very young age. He took over from somebody who'd been very well respected, and the team loved the previous person. And here was this person coming in as a young thing, and having to work with people who knew a lot more than him. And he said, I reflected at that point, I had a choice. And the choice was, he just literally got his team in the room and said, right, what are we all good at? What are we not good at? And so he addressed it right up front. And he said, so probably for me, learning from this is, if I ever had a choice on whether the imposter was there or not, that dealt with it, because we knew very quickly what we were good at and not good at. And it built trust pretty quickly too, because he was right clear on what he did and what he could and couldn't do well. Yeah. And invited that from others.
Fantastic. Well, thank you for sharing that. Amanda, from an individual team leader perspective, how do you think this shows up, or what does imposter syndrome look like at an individual level?
I really like what you said there, Angela, around the authenticity words, because when you think about imposter, almost imposters acting and pretending to be something that you're perceiving you're not, but actually the opposite of that actually is authenticity, isn't it? So it's shifting from this sort of pervasive worry and fear of, I'm not being myself. And what comes to my mind is almost a tug of war that goes on the inside between pleasing people and saying what I think needs to be said versus me being my authentic self, speaking up and being really honest and open. And it reminds me of, I see this a lot on program too, that inner critic can just be so huge when it comes to stepping into a strategic case study and needing to present to a panel and knowing nothing about the business, and it kind of really amplifies. And these two voices, aren't there? There's on one side, we've got that inner critic that comes from somewhere, but it's in there kind of knocking us back. And then there's this other voice of the let's call it the coach, who's wanting to kind of lift us up. And of course, the critic, I mean, it's not there for bad reasons, it's there to protect us. And we know that the brain's wired for negativity bias. You know, I don't want to repeat that criticism because it didn't feel nice, or I want to avoid that situation because
right.
I get criticized or rejected or whatever it is. And that fight goes on between the two voices. So this wants to keep us in the comfort zone, but this part of us, the coach, wants us to step out of the comfort zone and stretch and grow ourselves. And it's almost a case of, if we're swamped by the voice of the inner critic, we're going to kind of behave in certain ways, or if we're kind of tuned into that other voice, we're going to kind of behave in different ways. And it's sort of, you know, you might ask the question, well, which of these two voices is going to win the battle? You know, and the answer to that is the one that you most feed, the one that you most feed. So it's sort of, you know, which one are you mostly listening to? And I think the impact of, if you're dwelling in this space, unconsciously not realizing that this might be something called imposter syndrome, or that inner critic, really recognizing that, and you think about carrying that stress of worrying about whether you're going to be caught out most of the time, how's that going to impact you physically? It's going to wire your nervous system to be in stress a lot of the time, which is going to affect how you sleep. And we know that when you sleep, your hormones get regulated. And if we don't kind of take care of ourselves, we get that whole burnout thing, don't we? And of course, if we're constantly fearing, you know, what if I'm caught out or make a mistake, then you're probably not going to speak up around especially the senior leadership table. You might be comfortable in running your own department, but unlikely you're going to speak up in case you say the wrong thing. And of course, then the impact of that is we don't get the innovation that we know that we need right now in this constantly changing world. And of course, from a leadership development perspective, unlikely we're going to apply for that promotion because we don't think we're good enough as it is. And, you know, Gareth kind of touched on this, but there's some research in Sheryl Sandberg's book called Lean In, where she talks about, you know, if women have got 100% of the skills, they'll apply for the job. But men will apply for the job if they've got 60% of the skills. And I have to confess that 20 years ago, when ISL advertised that they were looking for leadership coaches, I read the job description and our person specification, and it said, right, you need a degree in psychology, tick. You need to have had 2 years working as a psychologist, and you need experience as a leadership coach, tick. But I didn't apply for the job because I thought, well, I'm not working as a psychologist. So, you know, it wasn't until Jeff ended up bumping into one of my clients and got to know that I was actually around that I then ended up having a chat, and away you go. So we get in our own way and we stop ourselves stretching and growing. And then, of course, in terms of leading others, what that means is that we're going to, I mean, if we set impossible standards because we're hoping for perfection, I mentioned earlier, we'll end up micromanaging and what have you. And of course, when we set these impossible standards and try and be perfect, if this is a view, especially around the C-suite, or when you think the higher you climb, the bigger the expectations are around being perfect or performing, then of course, if we're coming from that perspective, we're going to avoid disclosing. We're going to avoid actually being vulnerable. And then we're all going to be expecting each other around that table to be perfect. And then that's not going to pave the way for us to shift into this authentic space. So that tug of war is going to be constantly going on. And of course, if we've got that constant drive to prove ourselves, we're not going to be great role models actually for everyone else in our organization. That's going to lead to overwork and this sort of, oh, well, they're working all the hours under the sun, then therefore I need to too. And of course, that's going to set up a lot of the issues that we're seeing pervading organizations right now from a mental health perspective.
Yes.
It has huge impacts on both personal and leading others and leading organization.
And you see this playing out with various managers and executives that you're coaching, Amanda, and the programs that you're involved in?
I do. I mean, when people come on our program, they start off by getting that 360, or we call it 063, looking in the mirror at their leadership. And what's really amazing about sort of on program, we create a lot of psychological safety, and I know we've done a seminar on that already, but we give full, absolute permission for a person to show up as they are and to be able to disclose and share. And then what you hear is a lot of this is actually going on. There's a lot of fear around not being good enough, a lot of fear around speaking up and speaking out, and people holding themselves back. So you can't be the best that you can be without that kind of inner sense of confidence around being my authentic self. Right. So a lot of what we actually do on our 5, 6 day and 7 day programs is helping a person connect into their authenticity and to kind of be validated around what are they doing that's going really right. Mm-hmm. And I would argue that every single person who comes on those programs is doing something really right. They've already earned a place at the table. Nevertheless, everyone on day one sort of, who's who in the room, and we're not hearing it, but we can see comparativitis is going on left, right, and center, and and it's sort of there in the room. So
that's deep. Well, that's incredibly insightful. Look, that leads perfectly into the next section of the webinar, which is around the panel today are going to be able to provide sort of tips and tools and tricks now to help everybody listening in and connecting with the webinar on how to work their way through imposter syndrome. How does that show up? And then what are some tips and actions that they've learned in their experience that they can share? So let's start with you, Gareth. From an organisational chief executive leadership perspective, what are some of the tools and actions and tricks that you've learned over time that you've been able to share with people you've been engaging?
Let me share a quote. I've been burning to get this out, Nick, and I haven't been able to get it. So
now's a good time.
Limelight, yeah, I'll put it out. Susie Kaysen from America has said that doubt has killed more dreams than failure ever will, which I thought was incredibly powerful. I was talking.
Say that again, Gareth. Just say that one more time.
Doubt has killed more dreams than failure ever will.
Oh, wow.
Which I thought was incredibly powerful. And a lot of it's got to do, I spoke to an alumni in Melbourne recently, and I asked her, have you ever suffered from imposter syndrome? And she's very senior, very experienced person in our community. And she said, yeah, this morning when I was walking the dog, I was just simply walking my dog and thoughts crept into my mind. And I said, how did you handle it? And she said, well, I don't think I've ever perfected fixing it. She said, I had to let go of perfection a long time ago.
Right.
He said, but I captured the thoughts, and it's literally like all the tools at Smart Leader. What you measure, you fix, or what you're aware of, or what you talk about. And I noticed there was a question in there in the bottom asking, is talking about it make it a bigger issue? I'd say talking about it creates an opportunity for self-awareness. And like this lady did, in that moment where she caught those thoughts popping into her mind, simply when she was walking her dog, thinking about the day, she told it to go away. She's got a strategy on how to pop the bubble or the pimple and push it all away. How do we gain that self-awareness? And a lot of it's even like, what are the voices inside your head telling you? It's like an NLP type strategy. How can you capture it, process it, realize that it's there, not fix it or make it perfect, but just park it, put it aside, write it down, whatever your doubt is. And I think, it doesn't matter. This is not limited to junior people. It's not limited to senior people, but I would say it impacts, from what we see on our programs, right up into the CEO level, where people are highly accomplished, highly experienced, got accolades, awards, you name it.
Yes.
And they're still doubting themselves on why they're there. What's getting in the way? And Amanda and I love these type of questions in our coaching. What gets in your way? And it's generally yourself. So, how do you free yourself of the shackles of that imposter syndrome or that negative thought or feelings or whatever else? But I think it's totally normal. It's very human. Leaders have got a role in setting the right culture. You touched on that before, Nick. From a leadership point of view, you need to set the tone on having an appropriate culture, not avoid challenge, step into challenge and encourage and support and back people. Be a very visible leader that's there to support them through the good and the bad would be my insight and tip.
And through that, in the challenge of, if people do make mistakes, have a culture where that's okay and learn from that, learn quickly, move on. What did you learn from that you can take forward with you as a leader? Thanks, Gareth. Angela, tips and tools, actions from you.
Yes, thank you, Nick. And I've just been looking through some of the questions people have asked as well. So, look, the first thing I would say is, and to Patricia, to your point, striving for authenticity, absolutely. So the first piece around being authentic is to just recognize that often we're a work in progress, and be gentle on ourselves in how we show that authenticity to others, that it is, and this comes into the psychological safety piece as well, as leaders and influencers in our businesses, we have the opportunity to go, you know what, I'm aware I've got an imposter playing out right at this moment. What I actually want to say is blah. And just know that if you create a safe environment where you, starting with self, lead self, where you start to have those conversations, then it will be pervasive in a positive way. So really striving for that authenticity is key. So allow yourself to press pause. So rather than react to a situation, respond to the situation. That awareness leads to that ability to respond in any moment, and maybe re-choose how you'd like to play things out. The other thing that I would say too, and coming into the celebrate the differences that we have, because we do have differences. So, however an organization might do that, and that can be from a cultural, let's do shared lunches of different cultures. It can be from a, hey, you're more detail and data oriented. Can I just pick your brains around this? Because I tend to be mostly big picture. So just being aware of those differences and celebrate those. So it isn't always a traumatic piece. So I think Michael in the questions said, is there a relationship between the imposter syndrome and the social anxiety disorder? Absolutely, there can be, but it can also flip. So for me in my journey, absolutely, it led to anxiety and depression actually, and burnout. But it needn't be if we are open and authentic with it. So it's then about reframing. So it can be our biggest strength, is that awareness of it. So really just thinking about that reframing for a moment and just identifying whatever thoughts and behaviors we're going through, understanding perhaps if there's a little bit of an imposter moment, why that might be popping up now. What's that? Just allowing that conscious light, that reflection. So why has it popped up, and what could an alternative be? How could I do that? Having a trusting relationship with your leader where you might go, you know what, this is playing out for me. Can I just play with this idea and reframe how I might actually work through this? And then that creates that new neural pathway, if you like. So creating a new thought or behavior, that might be a little uncomfortable at times, but that's the growth zone, right? Take responsibility for that. This is our journey. This is my journey. This is me that is creating this, to Amanda's point earlier. Often it's in our head. And so then allow yourself to just reflect often. So go back, reflect, re-choose, reframe. So that's how I'd sort of describe it, I guess.
Fabulous. Thanks, Ange. That's great. Incredibly insightful. Amanda, what sort of tips and actions and solutions have you been able to provide over the years?
Yeah.
What's your thoughts in this space?
Yeah. I guess the first thing I would say, because when you think tips and tricks, it sounds like we're just rattling off, or it sounds really super easy to do something with this. And I think it's really important to acknowledge, actually, it's challenging.
It's complex.
It's complex. It's been programmed in. So it's not a super easy thing to turn the button, flick the switch on and, I've got it now and now it's gone. and this would be from my own experience and from my experience of coaching others. So I find, honestly speaking, I find it can kick in and be triggered at different times. Not unlike you, Angela, I've overworked and been the superhero and trying to prove myself, especially earlier in one's career. And certainly at the beginning of my setting up my coaching practice, I, you know, in that moment felt a little bit like a fraud, and it was quite strong and amplified. So I would say the overall, the key and the beginning of the change in all of this actually is, as Angela mentioned, becoming conscious of it. Right. And the consciousness requires effort, actually, because if we're unconscious, then we're just going to, you know, like Henry Ford said, if you'll keep doing what you always did and always get what you always got. So number one is it just requires effort to actually become conscious. And for me, what's been really helpful, and in terms of encouraging others and has been helpful for them too, is if you keep driving the jet boat with your head and mind sight fixed on the future, you don't notice what's going on around you because you're going at warp speed, and you don't notice what's happening within yourself, and you don't notice what's happening within the team as well. So the key for the beginning of the change of all of this for me within a person is to give yourself the time to reflect, actually. And for me, the best way to do that has been through journaling, just sort of putting into your schedule a reflective times to reflect. And I find if I look at I've been journaling for years, but funnily, there's two things. When I look at my journal and why I use it, number one is when I'm not, you know, when something like this is coming up for me to try and work it out. Right. And number two is to find a solution to something. And it's kind of those two areas. So number one is, I would say, become aware of it. And then knowing that I know it's in there, it's a pattern that's there in my neural pathways. So rather than resist it, because what we resist persists, is to go, okay, that's that pattern happening right now, and to befriend it, if you like, not push it away, because if we keep pushing it away, it gets louder, and you'll never win the battle between, you know, in your head in that respect. It's okay, here you are. You're wanting me to stay safe. I get it. I know your positive intention. And then Angela mentioned the idea of then reframing. So this is when I get my journal out and I dig in and find out, well, why is that? Why have I been triggered? Why did that happen? And, you know, what happened? So you can then get really clear and then find a sort of stoic way of making a plan. Or to reframe some of those, okay, what's triggering that? What's the belief that underlies that? And to head into like questioning your beliefs a little bit. So in coaching, I'll often find myself asking the question, well, you know, if they say, well, actually, I don't really deserve that promotion. A question I'll often ask there as a coach is, well, is that true? Right. Is it absolutely true? Yeah. Is it a fact?
Yep. Or is it your perception?
Yeah. And right. Actually, they'll come to that conclusion. Yes. And then sort of some really useful coaching questions following that is, well, you know, how are you going to react when you believe that thought? Right. And who are you going to be if you didn't have that thought? And then help them to kind of play around with it and dig it up a little bit, like uproot it and start to then think about, well, you know, what would be a more realistic thought, and help them to kind of cotton onto that. So if anyone wants any really useful sort of strategy or resources around this, Byron Katie has it's called the 4 Questions. She's an Australian psychologist. So Laxwitha, we might add that as a resource at the end of all of this, but her questions are really useful. And then I would say what I do then through journaling is amplify the voice of my coach. So, you know, when I set up my practice years ago, I used to come out of my home-based office and feel like I wasn't getting anywhere and no one wanted me and it wasn't working in the way I wanted it to work, and all of those, you know, thoughts that happen.
Yes.
I made myself do this exercise, which really got us turn around, and it helps any moment when I'm in a little negative spiral, is I'll just ask, okay, so what have I achieved today?
Right.
you know, what did I do today? And to take those moments to actually pause and acknowledge yourself, to really amplify the voice of the coach so that you're not getting swamped in and believing the story of the inner critic. And the other thing I'd say from a personal perspective is find someone you trust to talk it through. My husband has been an incredible supporter, and he's slapped me across the chops a few times around my silly negative thinking. And my coaching buddies, Gareth, have done that for me too. Isn't that right? And, you know, finding trusted people whom you can speak to, colleagues, another leader within another organization, join mentor groups, get support, because what they will offer you is a bigger and better perspective, which will give you more of a reality check, and then actually, you know, get a little bit of a turnaround. And that's what we're looking for. We're looking for a leapfrog from this inner critic shoulder onto the coach shoulder. And in essence, that's really what's required for you to empower yourself, basically.
And that's so true. And I often get young leaders coming through asking they catch up for coffee and a bit of a chat, and, you know, what did you do? And this is what I'm doing. And it's that opportunity where you're not quite as close to it or as attached to be able to give a slightly more pragmatic view, maybe because you're not so close. And that's why I always say to emerging leaders to find those wonderful mentors, to search them out, have people that you can meet with and run these sorts of ideas through and those conversations, because they're incredibly enriching.
Yeah, definitely. And what an external kind of voice, a mentor, a coach will also do for you is, in getting that reality check, will also provide accountability and get you to cotton onto A, how you're getting in your own way, but B, how that then impacts how you lead. And then encouraging you to really kind of look into, well, what does this mean, this that you're carrying? What does this mean for how you then lead others? Because Gareth touched on it early on, but it's that thing of, if we don't start having really open, honest dialogues about some of this stuff, and I guess I'm hearkening here to the Lencioni research, which talks about the first building block of building a high-performing team is trust, because if trust, psychological safety is not there, then we're not going to feel safe to master conflict, which is the second building block. But conflict in itself, a lot of people are really uncomfortable engaging in conflict. Some people love it and they just see it as a good argy-bargy. Other people are afraid of criticism, rejection, and all of those things that pop up, you know, in association to imposter syndrome. So, and I guess it's that thing of, well, the thing that Lencioni identifies as getting in the way of building trust. The number one thing that gets in the way of trust in a team and culture is when a leader is unwilling to be vulnerable. So there's a huge onus on the leader to not show up as a shiny, perfect model, but actually to show up as an individual, and to be willing to say things like, well, actually, I made a mistake, I own it, I apologize for it, or actually, I don't know the answer, I need some help with this, I need some support with this, and to kind of, you know, humanize up a little bit. And I firmly believe that has to start at the C-suite. That lead team is going to have an impact and ripple through the whole workforce. So, you know, that's really the place to start. But that's not an excuse for, if your C-suite don't do that and you're a leader somewhere else, then, you know, you're at the top of one other tree, and it's sort of the onus on you to start having these conversations. And what, going back to that hub events study, there were 4 key things that those, I'm just pulling my research, clearly I'm not remembering it, from the solutions of what the percentage, what people said they needed in order to overcome imposter syndrome. And this is what they said: 60% of the people wanted regular helpful feedback.
Right.
So regular helpful feedback is for leaders to consider, how much do I get that balance between corrective and critical feedback versus acknowledgement and positive reinforcement and praise. And I hear a lot of leaders say, well, I don't need it. So, they don't then realize why other people might need it. Or, well, they're just doing their jobs. They should just be getting on with it. But the point is, especially if you're new in a role or you're new in a responsibility or an area, you kind of want that affirmation or validation that you're on the right track, because otherwise it's a little bit like you've got your foot on the accelerator, but you're looking around if you're somebody who needs external feedback and you're kind of going, am I doing it right? So the hands on the handbrake.
Yeah.
And so you just give that bit of feedback. So I think more praise and more acknowledgement can really help. 44% of the people said they wanted a really open environment to discuss challenge.
Right.
And to feel safe to be able to say, this isn't working.
I need help with this. I'm not sure about this. Who else can lean on inside the team who might be able to support this particular challenge or opportunity? So true.
Yeah. And feel safe to be vulnerable. And the point being is, oftentimes, if you're my boss and I'm wanting to talk through things really honestly, and I'm a little bit nervous about being vulnerable. If you as my leader have actually said to me, well, actually, I've got some stories about vulnerability, and as a leader, you can think about what stories you want to share to kind of start to be open in this respect. But if my leader's gone first and kind of said, well, actually, when I was this age, I didn't succeed in this way, or this happened and it led to there, but I learned that, some of those stories, then if my leader's willing to be vulnerable with me, then I'm feeling now that this is a safe environment to be open and vulnerable with you. So kind of the leader needs to go first. 43% of the study said they wanted coaching and mentoring, and that really made a difference. And 33% of the people in the study said that access to mental health services would be really helpful. So I thought that would be really useful feedback as well.
Thanks, Amanda. Thanks, Gareth and Ange. That's incredibly insightful and useful information for everybody today. Look, we've got a couple of questions that have come through. We've got time for maybe one or two. Let's go to Rob's question. Rob's asked the panel, the description of imposter syndrome sounds to me like some of the criteria for judging Asperger's or autistic tendencies. Is this correct? What are your thoughts on Rob's question?
Maybe I should answer that in that I talked about the criteria, so it sort of probably falls under the piece I spoke about. So I hear what you're saying, Rob, and I would kind of say on a relational line versus an autistic versus Asperger's line, but actually, in truth, most people on that relational line, autistic and Asperger's people would be kind of off, they would be at the kind of lowest point around able to connect and relate to others. And what needs to happen from an imposter syndrome perspective is actually, we do have to learn the skills, first off, actually, of relating to ourselves, being able to go inwards and connect, and to start to kind of unearth some of the views and things that get in our way. And I guess the label we'd use for that would be emotional intelligence. Building self-awareness, self-management, and then those social skills to be able to do that outwardly as well. So yeah, I hear it. It kind of is kind of in that respect. And I would say that, yeah, it is a relational thing in that it's, who am I and how am I, and looking at that, and then how can I change it, and then sort of looking outwardly as well. So I acknowledge that it is similar to that, although I've never heard it labeled that per se. Thanks,
Amanda. Great question, Rob. Thank you for that. And now thank you to Patricia, who sent through a question around, does talking about imposter syndrome increase the prevalence of it? We've talked a little bit about this today. Angela, your thoughts on that? Patricia goes on to say, I'd be keen to use strength-based approach to describe what many experience, which is that kind of striving for authenticity. What's your thoughts on Patricia's question?
Yeah, I'm sort of thinking about that positive opposite, I guess. So, using Amanda's little critters on the shoulder and which one you want to listen to. I think it is around being authentic, and that striving for authenticity, I think, is key. So it is about leaders, as Amanda said, being able to say, you know what, I think I've really stuffed up here. This is what I thinks played out, and this is what I'm going to do about it. What do you think? And I don't think, we all just have roles in a company, right, or in an organization. While there is a hierarchy, there are also people dotted all across the organization that may have answers that we don't have. I remember working for an organization once where a person who I ended up using as a mentor was the person who, he was an older gentleman who had worked for a number of years and in various roles, and he had such good perspective. His role was in the organization I'm thinking about, was to be the caretaker within a manufacturing environment. So he was one that sort of made sure that the floor was swept, that, so seemingly not someone who in a hierarchical sense you would say will know stuff that I need in this moment. But boy, when I clocked him, he was the person that I could go to and go, you know what, I'm having this moment, and what do you think? Because he had time to think, and he was fantastic.
Wow.
And actually, I ended up sort of shouting from the rafters about his ability, to the point where probably he spent quite a bit of time working with others. So I think it is about having, again, that authentic conversation with someone, and that supervision, I suppose, piece.
Nick, can I just add one little point here on this note as well?
Sure.
Yeah, I just want to say that we'll ask the question that, if we speak about anxiety or depression in the workplace, does it make it more prevalent? And to me, it's more of a case of actually imposter syndrome is here. So speaking about it is important. And I would add that, in coaching, we spend 20% of time on the problem, but 80% of time on the solution. So it's more a case of where do you kind of land in terms of giving most of your energy and focus. And I love Patricia's way of saying, wouldn't it be better to talk about striving for authenticity versus dwelling in imposter syndrome? So yes, talk about it. It's here. It's here. And then where are we going here? What are we moving towards? So I love Patricia's comment. Thank you.
Thanks, Amanda. Well, look, thanks, everybody. That brings us nearly to the close of today's webinar. I just want to say, again, thank you to everybody for attending. We hope that this was an insightful and thought-provoking session where our expert panel were able to provide us with tips and some solutions and discussion points for you all as we unpack the effects of imposter syndrome, what it is, the different types, and maybe how to address this. We looked at a number of possible solutions, development strategies, etc. And with that, I just want to say a massive thank you, tēnei te mihi, to our panel, to Gareth, Angela, and Amanda for your time, sharing your experience and expertise, incredibly enriching. So thanks each and every one of you. I'd also like to thank Lasita, our Smart Leader Marketing and Operations Lead, for organising today's webinar, making sure we're all in the right place, doing the right things. So thank you to him. Today's webinar has been recorded, and we will be sending very shortly an email to you all, which will have the link to this webinar and also some of the key resources and some of the research that the panel have outlined today. What we've heard from the expert panel is that the foundation in overcoming imposter syndrome and building confidence to step up in your work and personal life is to go through a journey of self-discovery, understanding your personality, your strengths, blind spots, that unconscious mind. And we here at Smart Leader have developed a number of online learning and development courses which help better understand concepts such as imposter syndrome, such as our self-mastery course for individuals, our team player course for team development, both of which are self-paced, reflective journeys, which may help you uncover your true potential and understanding and mastering your emotions in the space. So please, if you're interested, check those out, and we'll put that on the email through to you all. So finally, we look forward to seeing you all at our next webinar, which will be in September, and the details will be closely followed with the email that will be sent out and the link. Thank you all once again for joining us here today. Have a great rest of your week, everybody. And on behalf of the team here at Smart Leader, we look forward to seeing you again very soon. Mate wā.